This session is titled Understanding Farmland Diligence. So we're going to walk you through some of the questions we as a team sit down and think about when we're considering any farmland purchase. The hope is that by the end of today in the question and answer session, you have the tools that you need to go out and also do your own research and diligence on potential purchases, whether that be on the AcreTrader platform or on your own. I'm joined by my two colleagues, Jacob Carter and Kyle Knight. You got to know Jacob a little bit earlier in some of his story. I was going to ask Kyle just to give a brief background. I think one of the things that we really focus on our team and are really proud of is the fact that many of us have a direct operational attachment to farmland in our backgrounds. Kyle is no different. So Kyle, if you want to talk a little bit about your background and sort of the credibility and what makes you who you are.
Yeah, sounds good. I do have a little bit of a unique background compared to probably many in this room. So for the first 30 years of my career, I spent in production agriculture. Part of the area that Sky Root just mentioned in the Columbia Basin of Washington, I essentially farmed in a 3-county area and focused on potatoes, but had an array of, I think last time I counted, 26 crops that I planted. Not all of them at one time, but over that course of 30 years. And so I gained a lot of experience. I will tell you, I was a little bit, and I as exciting and as interesting as it was, and much as I enjoyed it, I was somewhat bored. And I know that's sort of odd to say if you're in production ag, but there was a time I spent 3 years during that time working for Merrill Lynch as well, just trying to keep me a little bit stimulated with what was going on in the markets as well. And so following that, I worked for a hay export or a forage export company for 5 years, and we grew from throughout the West. We grew forage, about 17 different forages, anything from Klein grass to Timothy to alfalfa, that we exported to 35 different countries throughout the world. And part of my, well, not part of, my responsibility was the production side of the forage that we grew ourselves. And so we were in about 8 different states that we grew forage in. We started about 14,000 acres, and in the 5 years that I was there, we grew to about 45,000 acres in those 7 states. So I got to learn Western, all about most of the Western areas, and very much enjoyed that. And then, as Ben said, I've been the last 7 years with Farmland Reserve, based up in Indianapolis. So I don't know if that gives you.
No, that's perfect. I think part of the reason having you share your story is, we tell people you can do about 80 to 90% of the underwriting on an acquisition from behind a computer by making phone calls, doing some of that desk diligence. There's an intangible 10 to 20% of the process that involves the site visit, it involves getting on the property, and it involves the specific knowledge that somebody who's worked in the industry would only have. And so I just want to highlight these are 2 key players of our farm acquisitions and diligence team. There's many of them also in the room today. You'll hear from another one this afternoon, Rob. But I just want to highlight sort of the experience that our team has as we talk through the different questions we might consider when we're considering a purchase of any property. So thank you for sharing with that. Before we jump into it, I want to sort of prime you to be thinking about potential questions you might have about our process at AcreTrader, about farmland underwriting in general. We're also going to do a Q&A the second half of this, so please be thinking about that in advance. To get started, where I want to start is this idea, or what we call the problem of farmland. And that might be a funny way to think about it, but the problem of farmland is essentially, it is a very difficult asset to understand for a number of key reasons. The first is that it's a non-homogeneous asset, right? So a corn farm in Iowa doesn't look like a corn farm in Arkansas, and you can't make a comparison between the two for a number of different reasons. Not even neighboring farms are the same in a lot of places. The second is that there's a lack of good public data for understanding farmland valuations and the sort of the history of a property. So there's no MLS for farmland. You've probably heard that before. It's nearly impossible to find good, comparable sales data or even basic information about property assessments and water bills. You go to purchase a farm and you can't even figure out what the water bill was for the last couple of years. And finally, it's difficult to find farm records. So a lot of operators don't keep very detailed records about yields that they might have had on the property. You can't find maps of improvements of that property, whether it be tile drainage or underground irrigation pipe. And finally, there's no audited financial statement when you go to look at buying a farm. And so you have this lack of information, this vacuum that you're staring into when you consider a farm purchase, and you have to begin to sort of untangle that knot as you look at the basic facts that are available to you, some of which we're going to discuss today. As we move through some of those concepts, or those vignettes, I'm going to sort of ask questions of Kyle and Jacob, invite them to participate with their experience. So before we get into that, I mean, what else would you guys add to that idea that farmland is tricky and difficult to value because there isn't a lot of good information out there?
An interesting thing, again, because I was in production ag, and I can tell you this, even when I was in junior high and high school, I can remember riding with my dad in a pickup and him saying, "That's not a very good farm there," and I would ask him why. And he would say, "Well, I was there, I farmed that for a while, and it just didn't perform." And I think you could go to any area with any producer and you could ask them that question, and they would know, just like a checkerboard, which ones were good and which ones weren't. Our challenge is, like what Ben's saying, is we have to make that determination without reasonable data. Now, we have data, but we don't have reasonable data. And the reason we don't have reasonable data is because if I'm Farmer John and I think that you're going to sell the farm out from under me, I'm not going to furnish my data with you, whether that be yields, soils, anything. Now, as an owner, I can get that, but oftentimes they're not sophisticated owners that own the farmland that we're buying from, so it becomes difficult to gain that. I don't know if that helps, but again, those things are all possible to get. It just takes effort and reasonable time to pull together. Yeah,
I would just add that the idea again of hyperlocality here in our world is still a really key concept. As Ben just said, in California, you can be looking at a farm, an almond orchard in one irrigation district, and an adjacent farm in a different irrigation district will be worth maybe $10,000 less, but you think it's exactly the same. And the main difference will be most of the time that one irrigation district has secure water and the one right next door that is adjacent does not have secure water. Or in one case, recent example last week in California, we're talking about a specialty crop and they were even part of a water district but didn't have any turnouts or infrastructure or ditches or canals. So they were in the district but didn't have district water. So again, this hyperlocality concept I would just throw out again. And then from my previous experience as well, whenever I'd go look at a business, I'd say, could I have just 3 to 5 years of your past audited financial statements, please? And they would produce that in private equity. That does not exist here. As Kyle said, there are incentives to not share information. And again, we're dealing with individuals who are owner-operators. I mean, they're family farmers in many cases, and it's their proprietary information, and then also nobody's asked them for that information before. They haven't had to produce it. So we're the first one asking them for some of this data that is critical for our analysis.
I would just add some of the largest owners of farmland in the world don't even have good records, so it's not always just the smaller operator, right? So the first theme that I want to start with is probably the most obvious one when we're thinking about evaluating a property and doing due diligence, and that is the soil of that property. So we typically, in our process, think about soil through 3 different lenses. The first would be, what is the chemical, or what are the intrinsic productivity features of a soil? So its chemical nature, its tilth, the size of the soil particles, and that has a lot to do with what type of soil we're talking about. So you have clay soils, you have sandy soils, you have loamy soils, and so each one of those soils is going to have a highest and best use. So you might grow your rice on your clay soils and your cotton on your sandier soils, for example. So that's the first lens, and probably the one that most people are familiar with. The second would be the positioning of that ground. So does it have a steep slope to it? Is it irregularly shaped and thus difficult to farm? So there's sort of how is the property located within the local environment around it? And then the third lens that we would use is sort of the ability to modify or improve the soils that are on that farm. So that could be cutting and leveling the farm like we discussed in the last piece. It could be adding or removing terraces to a steep hillside, or it could be a land conversion. Maybe you're changing pasture land to cropland or cropland to permanent plantings like almonds. So we see a lot of that. I guess I would ask you guys, when you're looking at a farm, what are the first elements of the actual soil on that property that you're going to take into consideration beyond the items that we just sort of highlighted?
You know, it's interesting, and that's a great question, Ben. It's probably more has to do with the area that you're in. And let me give you an example of that. If I'm looking at ground, or we're looking at a farm in Illinois, for instance, if you know anything about Illinois history, Illinois was a swamp, essentially. I mean, there's higher ground.
Some parts still are.
Some parts still are. And so when, in fact, some of the previous speakers were talking about tile, where does tile get its name? It gets its name from every town had a blacksmith shop in Iowa or Illinois and Iowa. Every town also had a tile shop. They called it a brick shop because they also made bricks for homes, but they made tiles, and those tiles were anywhere from 4 feet long to a foot long, and they were hollow. They would put them in the ground, and they would act just like that plastic tile they talked about previously. We still run into that tile in Illinois, Indiana, and elsewhere when we're putting plastic tile in. So what I'm saying is it works. It still works in most cases, and that ground would be swamp ground if it wasn't tiled. So that's one of the things you look for is that tile. So in Illinois, is the farm tiled? Is it even able to be tiled? There can be a wet farm in Iowa, or excuse me, in any state for that matter, that you can't get the water off of it. In other words, there's no drainage to take the water to. So you're sort of stuck. So again, those are basic things. So it depends the state, but that's something I would look at there, for instance.
I think the only thing I'd add is an analogy I heard a couple weeks ago in California where a farmer was talking about farming on top of camouflage. And I didn't know, I was like, what are you talking about? And if you've looked at soil maps before, on one farm, on a 40-acre piece of farm, you can have a lot of variation in soil on that farm. So when he was saying camouflage, like the patterns are really weird. And I guess I just say that unless you know that farm and you can explain that variation, which sometimes, you know, on flatter topography, maybe you don't have as much of that variation, but when you have slopes and a little topography, you're going to be farming on camouflage, and you're going to want to know, you know, where you need to apply more chemical or fertilizer and whatnot. And again, that idea is that go check out a soil map, go to AcreMaps when we launch it for you, free. But go to look at soil maps, and you'll see what I'm talking about. One of my favorite moments at the company recently was listening to farmers, as Garrett, our COO, called it, pop wheelies, when they were talking about mentally, psychologically popping wheelies, when they were talking about the variation between a Wasco sandy loam and a sandy loam somewhere else, and all these different soil classes. I don't know, the names, there are like a bazillion names of soils. And we were talking about all that variation, and it was the equivalent of, if you know your soil type very well, it lets you pop wheelies.
Well, I can tell you Ben knows most of the names of all the soils. I've never met anyone that knew the soils quite as well as he does. But an interesting side note as well, just to give you an example, on AcreMaps, for instance, one of the tools it has is going back in time. So you can look at a parcel of property and go back the previous 10, in a few cases 15 years, and see what that was. We, as to Jacob's point, one of the things that we love is to look at a farm that that whole field is the same exact color of green or the same exact color of brown if it's in the winter. Because again, it's the same quality of soil, same type of soil, it's draining well, there's no ponds, there's no puddles. So again, that's data that we can pull from a system that we have, but again, there's still some value in looking at that parcel, but the data that we gather is very important.
Yeah, thank you. I think we'll move on to the next major consideration, which is water. You heard a lot about water in the previous presentation. The first question that we will ask is there too much or not enough water? So as the previous speakers alluded to, in the Midwest, frequently the problem is how do I remove moisture from the field, and tile drainage is the answer in that case. In places like the U.S. South and in the West, it's about bringing water to the farm. So that's the first question. Is my problem too much or not enough water? And you definitely have a problem. You just need to know which one it is. The second question would be, how do I deliver the water to my crop? So is there a center pivot irrigation system? Is it row irrigated like Gwen spoke about? In the case of Jacob's story, maybe I have great access to surface water, but there's no ditch to physically get the water to my property. So you need to consider those physical elements of your irrigation system about actually getting water to the crop. And for what it's worth, the farms that are center pivot irrigated are worth far less when it comes to valuations than leveled and furrow irrigated farms are. So these things all add up at the end of the day when it comes to farmland diligence and valuation. The third question would be, how many sources of water do I have? So we have really three. If there's a fourth, I'd love to know about it. But we have rainfall, we have groundwater, and we have surface water deliveries. Surface water deliveries really are not common east of the Rockies, but in the West, very, very common, and many farmers rely on them solely. But basically, just to paint the picture for you, it's a large dam somewhere up in the mountains that collects rainfall and snow melt up there, and then a series of aqueducts and canals that take the water down to the users below. And then the last and probably the most important question is, what is the quality of my water source? So you can have multiple water sources, but the quality of your water source is critically important as well. You would ask questions about the condition of the aquifer that my groundwater well is pulling from. Some aquifers get recharged and some do not, and you need to understand where this water is actually coming from. The second, on surface water in terms of where it's coming from, one thing to keep in mind is that these dam systems and canal systems are highly regulated, and the deliveries from those systems to your field are controlled by someone who is not you. So when you're looking at your groundwater with a well, for example, in some places at least, you are determining how much water you're withdrawing from the ground, and it's solely your decision. With surface water deliveries, there's an entire business. Sometimes it's a parastatal type of business, but an entire business deciding who gets water and how much and what it costs, and that changes every single year. So there's a huge amount of variability in that. Jacob, you're a member on our team with the most experience in permanent crop analysis, which means you're in the West a lot. Yeah. What is your first question when you look at a property regarding its water resources?
Yeah, how many sources of water? And one really key element that took me a second to grasp was, does this property have enough water in the moment where everybody else is sucking on the aquifer at the same time? Which is to say, in the driest part of the summer, and my crops my trees need water, and all my neighbors need that same water, am I going to get my orchard, satisfactorily irrigated? And so that requires a pretty sophisticated analysis of analyzing peak demand for water and whether this property is going to be functional on that framework. So I think that's kind of it. Like, if you have enough water during that peak demand, and then you can say, I'm going to have that water in peak demand for the next foreseeable future, I mean, that's a good property.
Yeah, if you're looking at a permanent crop investment and you're on the buy side, you need to be asking for a water budget from the seller, or make it yourself, but you need to understand that peak demand, how much water you need, can I get enough acre foot of water or acre feet of water onto the property at the right time, so.
And I think another thing you would look at, or we would look at, is just, is there a secondary source for water? So if it is deep well ground, or if there's a problem with the primary source, where do we go? Because if it's 110 degrees out and that plant needs moisture and we can't deliver it, not only have you ruined your crop for that year, but maybe for multiple years in the future. So it's critical, at least in the West, for that irrigation.
Kyle, with your experience in Indiana and the Midwest, what I most commonly hear from farmers is that when you pay to install drainage tile, it always pays itself back. Have you generally found that to be true in managing the farms that you've had in the past?
I have. In fact, there's been a few people that have tried to put that to a spreadsheet, have tried to actually quantify that, and boy, it's a difficult thing to do, but everything tells me, every property, I have seen every property, without exception, the drain tile in a 10-year period has paid back the producer and the owner of the ground multiple times. But it's hard to put that on paper and know exactly what that is.
I think a Midwestern farm with tile, Gwen would call that fixed.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I think the next section we're going to dive into is the concept of the financial profile of the farm that you're looking at investing in. So that can be broken down a couple of ways. The first is that you just want to know basic benchmark information about what rates of return are like for that type of farmland in that region. So you can get that data from a number of different places. NC Reef publishes a farmland index. AcreTrader is actually a contributing member of that index, but you need to know what is a reasonable rate of return. We do get occasional calls from people who want a 6 to 8% return on corn ground in Iowa, and they're just never going to get that on an annual basis. And so you do need to sort of level set your expectations on what sort of yield, what sort of cash yield is reasonable for this crop type in this geography. The second would be land value trends. And what I mean by that is not the precise value of the land. I think that's probably a fool's errand to try and calculate exactly that land's value and suspend it in a moment of time. But what you do need to understand is the directionality of land values in the neighborhood that you're looking at. So there are certain areas in the United States that have had pretty flat land values for a long time. And those are generally lower productivity areas, drier areas. But it's important to know the directionality of land values in the area that you're considering. What have you been seeing, Kyle, in terms of basic cap rates throughout the Midwest, let's say over the last 5 years? I mean, where are we at today?
Well, in the Midwest, let me preface that by saying this, and again, I go back to, that's why I've got the gray hairs, and I'm allowed to give a little bit of history once in a while. When I first started farming in 1982 in Washington State, ground was selling for about $1,000 an acre. Now, 2 years later, when the whole economy, in fact, my first operating loan was for 18% interest, and it about scared me to death. I remember sitting in the pickup after I'd been in to talk to the bank, and I just said, what am I doing? This is insane. So 3 years later, when the whole farm economy tended to, at that time, fall apart, and that $1,000 ground that all of a sudden went in 2 years to $2,000 was now nobody would even buy for $800 an acre. And there was people fleeing it because they were again, they were saying the market's not there. There's no way you can make this work. I saw really poor ground, not rent, during that time. And yet within 5 years, that same ground was $4,000 an acre. That ground today is worth $15,000 or $16,000 an acre. And my point is, and why I wanted to preface that is because if we try to time the market, we'll almost always be wrong. It's like buying any investment. You're almost always going to be wrong. The answer is to keep buying and to buy and be consistent with it. And as I look back in my history of my life, that's the mistake I made in 1982. I wasn't looking at the $1,000 ground going, boy, I had to buy all this I can. I was like, I don't want to own this stuff. This isn't good. and yet it was the wrong approach. So to answer your question, those returns that I've seen in the last 5 years in the Midwest, for instance, have been anywhere from 4.5% down to 2.5% operating return per year. Right now, that's tough to get that high number. Why? Because prices have gone sky high over the last few months. And again, it's not bad. It just means that it ebbs and flows, and right now we've got a little bit of a high cycle. So.
Yeah, why don't you add the permanent crop perspective and what reasonable rates of return are, at least today in this moment?
Yeah, on the operating returns, cap rate concept in permanent crops, it again depends on the highest and best use of that property, but and what it can grow. But it's 4 to 6% kind of operating returns, and that's not a total return number, so that's not thinking about land appreciation. But we're seeing cap rates really getting pushed down, especially if you're in a very sexy crop like pistachios.
That's very helpful. So the next element of our process is thinking about the region in which the farm is located. So we have a core farmland region bias. So there are some areas that lend themselves better to investable farmland than others. The traits that those places possess are primarily a highly liquid land market with a lot of sales. That means, number one, you can have good comparable sales and properties, but number two, a potential buyer if you think about exiting. And then the second trait that those places have would be a wide tenant market. We discussed that in the previous panel, but having lots of options for different partners to work with. So the sort of strength and growth of the farming community you're looking at is critically important as well. How would you guys think about, as you look across the United States, we'll keep it here, as you look across the United States, what other things do you look for that define a investable geography for you that makes you more comfortable?
The thought that came to mind was just the infrastructure around the farm in that area, which is to say, how far away am I from my processor? How far away am I from the service providers or the contractors that I need to help me farm my farm? So, just the same way you have that kind of basis risk concept, how far away are you from the grain elevators? That is critical. And again, we're just talking about the U.S. here, but if you go to a place like Brazil, for example, and this farm could look amazing on paper, it could produce killer yields, but they're literally like dirt roads that connect this rando farm in Brazil to the processor, and it takes you 10 days to get there. That's not a good farm all of a sudden. So I would just add that the infrastructure around getting my crop or the farmer's crop to market and getting that good price for the crop is key.
No, that's critical. In fact, that's exactly what I was going to say. In Washington State, it was the potato processors, the onion processors, those that had spent hundreds of millions of dollars to put their infrastructure there because they liked the climate, they liked the product they got, and the Lamb Westons and the Simplots and the McCains of the world spent a lot of money there. That's where you wanted to be. And that's, again, something that we look at when we're looking at a farm is there going to be demand for that farm ground in the future? Let me give you an example. I had a father-in-law that farmed for about 20 years in the state of Alaska. Now, most of us think, the state of Alaska, how in the world are you farming in the state of Alaska? Quite honestly, with their almost 24 hours of sunlight during the summer, it was tremendous ground. They did very well there, but again, they had no infrastructure. They had no support for that area. And I had a friend one time tell me, and I have thought a lot about that since. I don't necessarily agree with him, but I see his point. He was an Illinois farmer, and he said, you watch Illinois, and the best farm ground has paved roads near or by it. I said, well, but he's absolutely true. I mean, there's some exceptions to that, but it's true. And I want you to, next time you're around farm ground, think about that. If they've got paved roads, it probably means the tenants, the landlords, are doing well. Consequently, they're paying more taxes, which allow the roads to be built. And in some ways, they demand those roads. And yet, now Illinois' got other problems, don't get me wrong, but that's one of the things that he noticed. Is that something we necessarily use? No, but again, those are things that you really can't put a value. You can't even, again, quantify that, but there is something to it. So.
Yeah, thank you. The next concept we will think about is, the idea of knowing your farmer. So who is the tenant going to be? Who am I going to partner with on this property to get a good crop grown, harvested, and sold? There's the basic questions that you should obviously ask, which would be their level of experience, their reputation in the community, their financial solvency. But the three of us were talking earlier, and there's sort of three misconceptions that seem like obvious indicators of someone's skill as a farmer that actually can be quite misleading. So the first that we were talking about is that bigger is better. So if you're looking for a farmer for your property, you might reasonably say, let's go find the biggest operator in the area to rent this ground. And Kyle had some elaborate ways of describing why that is a suboptimal way to approach leasing your property. You want to elaborate?
Well, and I guess what I said to Ben was really whether they're large or small, it really isn't as significant, the size of their operation, as they're watching the little things. And what I called it was the guy that, and again, the blows and goes. In other words, he is going 100 miles an hour all the time. He doesn't worry about the small things, the little things that really make a difference between whether you're successful or not, in my opinion. But he's just going, and the more acres he can get, the more successful he feels. Not that he's necessarily making more on each acre or doing better than his neighbor, but that he's got more acres, and that fulfills him. Again, not sure that that's the best analogy, because I've seen some very, very good small growers, and I've seen some very, very good large growers, and everything in between. And it really comes down to somebody, and I think it was Sky that hit the nail on the head when he said that they treat the property like their own. And that is a saying that goes throughout the industry. We want people that are going to take care of the farm and treat it right, and let us know if there's a problem with the farm.
Yeah. And I'd only add that our sponsor team in permanent crops, which is me and Zoe and Drew, who you're going to hear from in a minute, we partner with farmers to align incentives in the permanent crop space over the long term. So we're looking for those really high quality farmers that are detail oriented, and we're trying to, in our world, get them aligned and put skin in the game and invest alongside our limited partners or our investors.
I would add just the comment. One of the things that for me sets apart a really good tenant from a poor tenant is transparency. And one of the things that I have been super impressed with, the best tenants, they will give me a financial sheet. They'll show their financials and they'll say, this is where I'm at. The poor tenants won't do that because they're more worried about somebody's going to see what I'm doing, or somebody's going to, the best tenants want to be transparent, as do we.
So the second misconception, Garrett actually touched on this previously, but the misconception would be that the highest yielding farmer will bring you the highest returns on your property. And we see this a lot with farmers sort of bragging about the number of bushels per acre that they got on a field. And certainly if you can get more yield out of the same property, that seems like it would be a positive attribute of a farmer to work with. But you have to ask the question, what are they spending to get there, right? So it's sort of this yield competition mindset of the only important thing is top line revenue, when in reality, their profitability, their ability to control cost is actually a more critical element of them being a good farmer and partner with you. So that second misconception is that higher yields equal higher returns. Anything?
I'd only add, our former CEO hammered it into my head at least, that it's all about margin per acre. Margin.
It's interesting. I'll share that. You reminded me, Ben, about that the inputs that a farmer puts in. I knew a farmer in Hermiston, Oregon, which is in a 6-inch rainfall area, very sandy soil, but it's an irrigated area. And he won the national soybean competition for yields for 3 years in a row. Now, this was back in the late 80s, early 90s. But there's not a soybean raised in Oregon that I'm aware of. 0 soybeans are raised there. But he couldn't help himself. He wanted, and his inputs were just astronomical. I mean, you couldn't have, as a soybean farmer, been able to do it, and yet he did. And he won the competition. He was so proud of himself, and he got to go back to somewhere in Illinois and had stand up on the stage and with this award. And again, what did it give him? Really not a thing.
Free hat.
Yeah, a free hat. And if he were doing that with 1,000 acres, he would have lost his shirt. But he was very happy. So anyway, I guess what I'm saying is, again, it comes back to why we do things. And I know people, we all know them, that they can't help themselves. They just have to put the money into it. But it doesn't make them more successful.
Thank you. The third and last misconception we'll address is the idea that shorter leases are optimal. So if you think about it, as a landowner, you might like the optionality to renegotiate the lease on an annual basis if you believe that crop prices might improve, or if you think demand to lease that property might improve. When in reality, when you look back on it, a medium to long-term lease might actually be more beneficial for you as the landowner because of some of the intangible things that may not come straight out of your pocket, right? So a lot of it has to do with how someone might treat the land when they have a longer-term lease. They're going to put more into that soil, they're going to amend that soil, and they're going to have a different mindset when they're on a 5-year farm lease as opposed to a single year-to-year lease where they feel like they're constantly being turned over and they may not even be on that property next year. Kyle, you've managed hundreds of thousands of acres, had quite a few leases, I'm sure, on your desk. How did you think about that problem?
Well, there's a couple ways to look at that, and the first way is not a good way. The first way would be we need to get soil samples, we need to get every production record that you're putting in, we need to know exactly what you're doing on that farm so that you don't take advantage of us as the landlord. The more reasonable way would be to say, let's give a longer term lease. Let's let them treat it like it's their own. And believe me, from a production perspective, if they're not putting the inputs in on an annual basis, they are not going to get the yields. It won't happen. There's a one-to-one relationship. If the inputs aren't there, they won't get the yields, and they know that. But just like the previous speakers, if the ground is mined, in other words, if they say to themselves, I've only got this for 1 year. I'm not sure I'm going to have it next year. Quite honestly, I'm not even sure I want it next year. I'm only going to put 1/3 of the fertilizer that I normally would put on, and I might not even put anything on because historically, ground will be able to produce for that year. But it's taking up those nutrients into the plant. Eventually, it won't be able to keep producing at that level. So when the next guy gets it, after they leave, and that's why you use the word mine, because they're mining those nutrients, just like a miner would inside for coal. And so that second person that gets on that ground goes, man, these nutrients are horrible. And they have to put a lot more money into it. Consequently, they are pushing back to the landlord saying, well, wait a minute, you're going to have to help me out with this because this guy left me in a real world of hurt. So that's the mining part that we all have to be cognizant of, why a longer term lease oftentimes is better. Not often, almost always is better with the right tenants.
Yeah, thank you. And then sort of the final lens to think about it in the due diligence process that we'll talk about, and then I want to open it up to questions. You need to determine what your objective is in starting the investment. So there's 3 basic ways to think about it. The first is my investment a value play? Do I think that this property will appreciate greater than other properties I might be able to buy right now? So it is a land appreciation focus. The second would be, is this a yield-focused investment? So there are lower quality properties that you can go purchase that have higher annual cash yields, but a smaller appreciation component to them. And then finally, there's sort of the value add mindset, right? So if I'm going to go purchase a property, drill a new well, level the property, and then maybe sell it in a shorter time frame than I would if I was holding it for an appreciation play, that's another mindset you might have. And so you need to think about all the questions we've just detailed through the lens of your objective as you begin the investment. Anything you guys would add to that? Did I miss any categories? All right. But I think we're ready for questions, yeah?
Yeah, I would just say I love that analysis because it really does create a lot of space for those of us who feel like we can add value to the due diligence process, add value to the property. We have tricks or tools in our toolbox that others don't, and when you have a large sample size of investments that you've looked at, you can run parallels and say, well, we do this here, and maybe we should try this there. And I would just say I love the framework, and I think it makes a ton of sense.
I'm just curious what's the percentage of farms that you physically visit, right? You make certain numbers make the cut digitally. What's the percentage of the farms you visit that become successful AcreTrader farms?
Great question, a common question. So as we mentioned at the beginning, our mindset is that you can do a lot of this with a computer, with mapping tools like Acre Maps, by making phone calls to references, but there is an intangible value to going to the property. Our core staff gets to a certain number of them, but beyond that, our farm managers or one of our Acre Pro agents, who are frequently our managers as well, one of them always gets to the property, right? So when it comes to our internal investments here at AcreTrader, either a contracted farm manager who represents us or a staff member internally goes to visit the property before closing.
Going back to the risks again, what are the common things you see people miss on the due diligence side?
Water.
Yeah, elaborate.
Again, it's just complex. The water security, peak demand. The quickest way to lose money in a farm is for you to not do your water analysis, because it'll take your dirt in California from $22,000 an acre for bare ground, and if it does have water, it's $22,000 an acre. If it does not have water, it's $2,000 an acre. So that would be a bad investment if you bought at 22 and sold at 2.
Is that the technical term? Yeah. I've got two of them that immediately come to mind, and the first is they didn't call the neighbor. And so that should be an important part of your research process, or visit the neighbor, go talk to them in person. They're going to tell you a lot of things about the property that the seller or the farmer who's currently farming it, if they're not the same person, did not tell you. And some of those things seem quite minor on the grand scale. For example, if the farm is alongside a creek or a ditch, does that ditch frequently get clogged and back up and flood parts of the field? The neighbor is probably going to be able to tell you those things. Do they have frequent problems with overspray from a neighbor who might be spraying dicambo or something like that? That's something the neighbor is going to tell you. So there are small little details that are hard to suss out from the representatives of the property that you can frequently get from someone in the community. The second thing that I would point out is, or that I see people miss, is I think they greatly overestimate, or they're too aggressive in their revenue assumptions for that property. Garrett talked about how corn prices have swung from almost $3 a bushel to almost $7 a bushel in 12 or 18 months, and that's going to happen all the time. And if you don't underwrite for the bear case, you'll be rudely awoken one day when your farmer says, hey, I'm not paying you that super high rent we agreed on because the market has changed. And so that's one of the things that we do as a team, sort of just an internal culture piece, is that we're super conservative in income estimations and how we think about the revenue potential of that asset into the future.
Yeah, I would just add, we would much rather each of you and ourselves be excited that we get a higher rent than we plan for, than have to tell you we're getting a lower rent.
I had a question about the appreciation for land? What are the driving factors? What are you looking for when you see a piece of land that you think is going to be more of an appreciation play than a yield play?
A lot of it has to do with the region in which the farm is located. If you are able to buy a decently priced farm in Champaign County, Illinois, you'll probably be a happy person in the future. But if you compare that to, remote corners of eastern Colorado, for example, the appreciation is likely going to be less in those areas. And so some of it is just sitting down and looking at average appreciation on an annualized basis state by state. That data is typically available. I think actually University of Illinois has a pretty good data set on their website, on their Farmland Research Center. So I would start there in terms of how do I think about what drives appreciation. It's just understanding the dynamics in the state that farm is located in. I think there's also a component to what sorts of crops can be grown on that farm. We saw after the renewable fuel standard came out in the early 2000s, a huge run-up in corn belt properties as we began to do more ethanol blending in our gasoline. And we didn't see the same sort of dramatic run-up in Delta farm prices. And so that doesn't mean the Delta farms were any worse, but what it means is that because those farms were tremendously productive in growing corn, their value, again, coming back to the value always reverts back to the asset itself in farmland. And so because corn was in demand for ethanol blending, those farms were particularly good at producing corn. They saw a much larger appreciation during that 10-year window than decent farms in the Arkansas and Mississippi Delta did. What else would you guys add?
I'd add just the idea that take Georgia, for example, where you can have cattle ranches and you have row crops and you have permanent crops like pecans. One great way to get land appreciation is to take a ranch land value and turn that into a pecan orchard. And so that's a moneymaker if you can find the right piece of property. So that, again, in dollar terms is I buy a ranch land at $3,000 an acre in Georgia, and I can turn that into a pecan orchard and sell. I mean, that sounds easy. Talk to Jesse, who's coming up. It takes a second to grow pecans, but that's taking you from $2,000 an acre to $20,000 an acre, and so that's land appreciation with value creation.
I would just add, again, just a little story. In 2017, I was riding with a couple people going by a farm in Champaign County. And this farm I knew 2 years ago, 3 years before that, in 2014, had sold. In fact, we had bought for $12,200 an acre. And the market in 2017 for that same ground was about $10,500 an acre. So I asked these two individuals that were with me, both executives in the company, I said, was that a good decision or a bad decision to buy that ground in 2014? And one turned to the other and said, oh, that was a bad decision. I said, no, it was a good decision. That same ground today is worth $15,000, $16,000 an acre. My point is, we can't time it. Again, going back to that, the answer is to buy land. It will appreciate. It ebbs and flows, but it will appreciate over time. History tells us that.
Yeah, Brandon Morris, who's here from California, and I were talking a year ago, and we were saying, well, when's the best time to buy land? In the past. Just buy it in the past.
And yeah, I think the last bit I would add to that is the best quality farms always appreciate at a faster rate than an average quality farm. So while the trend might be up for all types of properties, there is a real edge and advantage to having the best quality farms because they will always bring the top dollar in the market.
Yeah, so on the platform from time to time, you guys will have a farm that's organic. Can you talk a little bit about the diligence that goes into that, and then also how you structure the deal to ensure that the tenants, continue those practices and maintain any premiums associated with that property?
Andrew Jansen, are you still in the room? And I give the question to you. I'm kidding. We work with Andrew wherever he's at. Hey there. So Andrew and his crew, they farm several thousand acres organically in Nebraska. We have funded 2 investments with them on the AcreTrader platform, which we were thrilled to do, and I'm glad he made the trip out here. I think one of the things that people should understand about investing in organic agriculture in the United States is that everyone wants to assume that there's a magical premium attached to a property that is certified organic. It takes 3 years to take a conventionally farmed farm and transition it to the USDA certified organic standard. It takes 3 years. Once that process is complete, there's this, again, a misconception that the property is magically worth more than it was before. The problem with that is if the organic farmer that you've partnered with decides that they no longer desire that property for whatever reason, you then have to go find somebody to lease that farm or operate that farm. And if they're not certified organic themselves, or they don't have an organic farming operation, that farm has no premium on it, even though you've spent all the blood, sweat, tears, and money over 3 years to transition it into organic agriculture. And so that leads me to the 2 points at our diligence process when it comes specifically to investing in organic annual cropping. The first is that if we're going to invest in an organic property or one that's transitioning, we want to make sure that there are a lot of other organic operators in the area. So you don't want to work with the only person that does this in a 300-mile radius because you're not set up for success. The second would be that you really have more counterparty risk than you do in just leasing a conventional farm. And you have to ask a lot of questions about the marketing and the business health of the person that you're partnering with on that property. That's certainly one of the things we did with Andrew and his crew. And so there is more diligence required of the person you're leasing the farm to in an organic investment than it would be conventionally.
This might not be quite the right forum, but how much of this due diligence and things do you foresee the AcreTrader platform being able to perform for you, provide you? For instance, scoring a piece of land based on, the geospecs that you're getting from satellite images, those kind of things.
I'll sort of start. So I think our short-term efforts to address that question, if I was going to rephrase your question for you, like how do we automate certain parts of the underwriting process? Building the tool that is Acre Maps, which you've got a preview of, is our first effort at making some of this process more streamlined. Right now we go to 10 different tools to get all the same data sources and have to pull them in through their discrete platforms into one consolidated file. And so part of it is just simplifying and getting a better mousetrap with the tool that we're building internally. As far as the question of algorithmic scoring and putting a value on it with some sort of AI or machine learning, I don't particularly see that in our immediate future. I think there's a lot of potential pitfalls in the automatic valuation process, particularly for farmland. As we run through in this presentation, there's dozens of variables, everything from talking to the neighbor to what the weather does to hail in this area versus there's no hail over here, that are almost impossible to quantify. And so I think our process is in part automated by some of these tools we're constructing, but it will never get away from the specific knowledge of the place that is required in really understanding the value of a farm and if that farm is a quality property. So I guess to more directly answer your question, I think we will almost always lean on our team's experience, which we've kind of highlighted here, as well as the partners that we have, the different farm managers that we work with, while also seeking out better tools, again, like the one we're developing internally, to help speed up our decision-making process.